Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to the September 2023 meeting of the Montgomery County Civic Federation. My name is Alan Bowser. I'm currently serving as president of the Civic Fed. Thank you all for joining us this evening. We've got an exciting speaker and looking forward to hearing from him. We have a couple of things that we need to do before we get into our main program. The first thing we need to do is approve the agenda for tonight. It's listed on page 2 of the September newsletter. I'd entertain
motion to accept.
Thank you, Mr. Garson. Is there a second? It's second. It's been first and seconded. Any discussion? All those in favor say aye.
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 Raise your hand, indicate somehow, wave wildly. Thank you so much. The next order of business, we don't have minutes from the June meeting. The June meeting was our awards meeting that was held at the American Legion Post 41 in downtown Silver Spring. At that time, I'll mention that we presented the Star Cup to our secretary, Karen Cordry. We presented the Wayne Goldstein Award to two distinguished individuals, Cheryl Gannon and Kim Prasad. And we presented the Sentinel Award to an outstanding civic association, North Hills of Sligo Creek Civic Association, whose president is with us this evening. So thank you all for their support and for joining us at the June meeting. The next order of business is a treasurer's report from our president, Jerry Garson. Mr. Treasurer.
I'm Jerry Garson, the treasurer. Alan is still our president. We're on a fiscal year beginning July 1 and through September 11th. We've received $1,078 in dues. I want to thank every individual who's a member, every organization who's contributed dues. And we've had expenses recently of $182 on the website. And our total expenditures have been $478, giving us a net income at the moment of $600. Our bank balance is $8,102. And as one of the things that we normally do in the first meeting in September is approve our budget. Our budget expects our membership dues to equal $2,650. This can include possibly if we charge for the annual dinner next year. And we have expenses of $2,650. which are made up of a post office box and postage of $130, an estimate for website of $600, federation meetings of $50, awards dinner of $500, $300 for office supplies and support, $100 for committees and memberships of $300, insurance is $650 and $20 of miscellaneous, giving us a total expenditures of $2,650, giving us basically a no net income for the fiscal 23 year, which began on July 1 and ends on June 30th, 2024. If there are any questions or anything else, and I think we're supposed to have a resolution to approve the budget.
Jerry, I'm going to ask you to put all that information in an article in the October newsletter so delegates have a chance to look at it and ask questions rather than do it in this ad hoc fashion. So if you would just put that in the newsletter next time, we can vote on it next time.
Right. And Jerry, if you send it to me, I'll put it in the minutes as well. So
okay, you. Jerry.
Yeah, I'll send it to Karen.
One of the nice things that he could report on is that we have a new due system. We're working with a civic activist from either North Woodside, Genevieve, or Woodside, and he's helping us with a new due system. And there's an article about it in the newsletter. So thank you to everybody who has contributed via Simply Dues. We may have a conversation with this after Delegate Stewart speaks. Or who's sent checks to our post office box in Rockville. And then one thing I'd like to take care of right now is that I have the authority as president of the Civic Federation to nominate people for the executive committee. I've asked several individuals to step up and help us with our programming and our messaging and doing some of the hard work. Some of them are on the call this evening. But my nominations have to be ratified by the membership. So I would nominate Jay Elvov from the North Hills of Sligo Creek Civic Association, Brenda Freeman from the Woodside Park Civic Association, Cheryl Gannon, who's on the call from Woodside Civic Association, Daniel Mayer from East Silver Spring Civic Association, and Kim Prasad from the Wheaton Regional Park Neighborhood Association. Can I get a second on those nominations for people to serve on our executive committee? It's been seconded. Is there any discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposition? Any abstentions? Seeing none, the nominations have been approved unanimously. Thank you very much for that. And now it gives me great pleasure to turn this part of the program over to a good friend of many of us, especially the people in District 19. I've known Delegate Stewart for several years, and I've been impressed by his intellect and his energy and his willingness to offer legislation which is broadly progressive. And I'd like to see some more of it pass, particularly thinking about the homeowners bill that you had introduced. As a homeowner, I was particularly interested in that. But I was pleased to find out that Delegate Stewart is now the chair of the Subcommittee on Land Use and Ethics of the Environment and Transportation Committee, chaired by another one of our friends, Mark Corman. And since a lot of our conversations over the last year have involved land use issues, have involved ethics issues, we couldn't think of a better person to bring to the meeting tonight to talk to us about the agenda of his committee, what he thinks is on the horizon, and then answer any questions that some of you may have about land use ethics issues and issues coming before the General Assembly. So without further ado, let me introduce Delegate Vaughn Stewart, Democrat of District 19. Vaughn, please take it away.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Alan. I really appreciate the invite. It's an honor to be here with all of y'all. It's great to see several familiar and friendly faces of some friends out there. Hope everyone's having a good evening. We'll try to make sure that we're out in time for the big Monday night football game that I'm sure everyone is dying to see. But no, I thought I would just sort of go a little bit around the committee's work. As Alan said, my own work, my subcommittee's work, the committee's work. But I want to try to be as brief as possible, which is sort of famous last words for a politician, I guess. But try to be as brief as possible so that y'all have time for questions around these two topics that I know that the Civic Fed overall is very interested in, and I can try my best to answer any questions y'all have. So a little bit about me first, for those of you who may not be as familiar with me. I won this delegate seat in 2018. I was sworn in as a delegate in 2019, so I won re-election for the first time this past year. I am an attorney by trade. I actually decided to run for office in 2017 after I got cancer. It was the second time I had been diagnosed with cancer before the age of 30. And for me, it was just a really big proverbial kind of kick in the rear end to evaluate what my priorities were in life, what I wanted my life to be about, sort of what I was doing. I was not very happy at the law firm I was at. I was making pretty good money, but I also had hundreds of thousands of dollars in student debt. So it didn't really feel like it. And more importantly, I didn't feel satisfied. I didn't really feel like I was doing what I wanted to do. So there was an open seat in District 19. I decided to throw my hat in the race actually while I was still bald from my chemo treatments. And I knocked on a bunch of doors and I somehow pulled it off. But the reason, I can't really prove a causal link, but probably the reason that I had such bad cancer luck is because Monsanto used my hometown in Alabama as a dumping ground for toxins called PCBs. And so they dumped them in the air and in the water, They didn't even tell their own employees, much less citizens of the town. This has now been the subject of lots of lawsuits. My town was dubbed by CNN at one point as Toxic Town USA. It's now a Superfund site. The cancer rates are multiple times the national average. I went to like a tiny high school with 30 kids in my graduating class, and more than 5 of us have already had cancer. So I can't prove a link, but to me, I think it's possible that at least that with no cancer history in my family or anything, that Monsanto was sort of the cause of this. And I think that the reason I bring this up is I think that this topic about kind of the intersection between corporate power on the one hand and sort of community decision making on the other hand is something that comes up a lot on my committee. So I serve on the Environment and Transportation Committee. We have those two very important issues. We also have housing, and then of course we have both land use and ethics. And I think what's really thrilling about the work of my committee with our new chair, Delegate Corman from District 16, is that all these issues intersect a lot, and certainly land use and ethics intersects, but maybe not as often as you think. So I think historically my subcommittee, land use and ethics, was really land use, comma, dot, 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 ethics. And generally there would be bills in one bucket or the other, but very few bills that sort of linked the two. And that sort of changed a little bit this past session we can get into. But essentially the story with me in the subcommittee is this past January, the Speaker of the House was kind enough to appoint me to 2 actually new leadership positions. I'm now the chief deputy majority whip in the House, which basically means I'm like the number 2 whip in the leadership structure. And then I also got this cool gavel where I get to be the subcommittee chair for this land use and ethics subcommittee, which are 2 issues that I really care a lot about. So since I've been in the General Assembly, housing and ethics, I think, have probably been the 2 issues that I've been most active on. I was able to pass 2 bills on the ethics front. When my first couple of sessions, I passed a bill, revolving door bill, that basically said that agency heads could not go into some sort of job that was related to their employment, as a lobbyist or whatnot, for more than a year after they left office as an agency head. That's actually the rule that has applied to legislators for years, but it had never been applied to agency heads, even though, the sort of dirty secret is that, I guess it's not really that much of a secret, but the, transportation secretary, for example, or the Maryland Department of the Environment secretary is way more powerful than the average delegate and probably the average state senator. So we sort of closed that loophole in the ethics laws. And then starting in 2020, you guys may recall that Governor Hogan, our previous governor, had some ethics issues of his own. There was a couple of really sort of headline stories that that essentially he owned property. His family's development company owned property, and some of the places that he was putting transportation projects adjacent to. And this was big news because the legislature didn't really have any idea this was happening. And so more than just about that governor or his political party or whatever, it really put under a microscope a larger problem that we had as a General Assembly, which was the weaknesses, the gaps in our conflicts of interest rules, where people who, and I think still to this day, we haven't totally cleaned this up, but legislators that basically have a financial interest in matters that are being voted on and decided, it's not always foolproof that those types of conflicts are identified, acknowledged, broadly recognized. And in this case, there was a situation where the State Ethics Commission, which is responsible for administering the ethics legal apparatus over all the legislators and the agencies and the governor, it knew about these conflicts of interest that the governor had. It knew that he owned all this property adjacent to where we were pumping all these tax dollars into. But there was no real legal mechanism where they could share that information with the General Assembly and with the Budget Committee so that we knew that. So we closed that loophole. Another problem was that anytime someone is in the development business, it's not so much that they have a financial stake in one company. Maybe that's how it worked in the 60s. But now you have all these LLC sort of shell companies, sister companies, aunt companies, cousin companies. So we also updated our ethics disclosure rules to account for kind of the modern day way that these businesses are practiced. And that bill went into effect, I believe, in the last year's election cycle. or last year's reporting ethics disclosure cycle. So I had a couple of those ethics victories. I put in a lot of land use bills as well. One thing I've been really focused on personally is adaptive reuse of existing buildings. So I think especially in kind of this post-COVID era where a lot of employees are not returning physically back into the office, we've got this problem of a glut of commercial office buildings where in downtown areas, but also in suburban areas in Montgomery County, we've got a lot of office buildings with really disturbingly large vacancy rates. And of course, we also have this persistent problem of people who cannot find affordable places to live. And so it's almost too easy of a solution, in my view, to pair the two and to try to find creative ways where we can repurpose some of these existing buildings, whether they're commercial buildings or some other use, into housing. Because a lot of times these existing buildings are already in areas where there is enough infrastructure to accommodate new housing. There's already parking there. There's already sewer lines running there. There's already the sort of transportation infrastructure that we need. So rather than sort of build sprawl out in suburbia or densify, existing residential neighborhoods, it seems only natural that we would try to look at those adaptive reuse, as they say, projects first. And so I've had a couple of bills in the past, and I'll continue bringing them back to try to look at how we can make that more affordable for people to do. And then another big one of my own personal priorities is just pumping more money into the construction of affordable housing broadly. I think this has generally been seen, the idea of constructing new housing is something that only the market did. This is basically the approach of the entire United States, not to mention the state of Maryland, since at least the Reagan era, is this is something only that the free market could do, only the private sector could build housing, and that the state government and the local government really didn't have much to say about financing new construction or where it's located or how high quality is or how large the units are or how affordable they are. And I think that's changing in a number of places. And I've been sort of trying to lead the charge in Maryland on looking at how the county and the state can play a larger role in actually financing the construction of new publicly owned housing that's mixed income and nice and located near opportunity and transit and jobs. So those are some of the things that I've been focused on. Now, in terms of my subcommittee, the kinds of issues we've taken on in the past, and I'm sure we'll continue to do, number one, my subcommittee has been the site of all of the P3 related bills. So the previous governor, again, as I'm sure y'all remember all too well, had the approach to widen I-270 and the Beltway. This has been repurposed to some extent by the current governor. There were a number of different transparency bills around how our public-private partner process works in Maryland. I don't think it works very well at all. I think the bill that was initially written during the O'Malley years, I believe it was 2014, I think was just sort of hastily done. And I think that our P3 bill, if you look across the country, has a lot of weak points compared to its counterpart bills in other states. And so there have been opportunities to update that. Most of those bills have ultimately passed the House but failed in the Senate. And a lot of them did come through my subcommittee, and I'm sure we'll continue to see those types of bills, even though my understanding is that the current governor does not have much interest in using the P3 model as a way to finance his proposals regarding 270. Another issue that you guys may be a little familiar with, but is much more a hot topic in Prince George's County, is the maglev train. This also comes before my subcommittee bills dealing with that. The intersection, but this is an increasingly hot topic, the intersection between solar energy and the need to sort of build out solar infrastructure, but also farming and the idea of preserving farmland and supporting farmers and supporting agriculture. That is sort of those interests are sometimes in conflict, and I think increasingly so. That's an issue from one perspective or another that's often brought for my subcommittee. And then just on the ethics front, generally, we see a lot of bills about more transparency, lobbying rules. I put in a bill strengthening our lobbying rules a couple of years ago that proved to be somewhat controversial. It did not pass, but it basically dealt with gift restrictions for legislators, which, as you can imagine, didn't make me. I was sort of temporarily relatively unpopular among legislators regarding that. And I was also actually trying to increase the dues that lobbyists pay. There's like a $100 lobbyist registration fee in the state of Maryland, but it's like we haven't changed it since maybe the Ford administration. Like, it hasn't been updated for inflation at all. And you can look at the lobbyist disclosures. A lot of these folks, even the junior lobbyists, are making $500 or $600,000 a year. So I was saying, like, let's raise it to, I don't know, $200 or $300, and then use that money to fund the state ethics commission, which is chronically underfunded and understaffed. That's kind of our policemen, our ethics police power, and they never have enough staff to do more than just kind of routine compliance. But that bill a couple of years ago kind of went down. But we get a lot of bills on gift rules, transparencies, live streaming of meetings. I'm a big proponent of making, basically every different type of agency come under the sunlight of YouTube live streaming. And in terms of what's coming up, I hope I'm still on track here in terms of timing. In terms of what's coming up, it's a little bit hard to predict. We're still just after Labor Day. The General Assembly session, is, I'm sure most of y'all know, will start. It's around January 11th or so this year. So there's still a few more months until most people start putting their bills in. But I do know that housing broadly, and the intersection between sort of housing and land use, will, I think, continue to be a big issue. Zoning continues to be a big issue. A lot of these issues that we've dealt with at the county level around missing middle and density and ADUs is starting to pop up more and more. There was recently an ADU task force bill that was passed to create a statewide ADU task force. It's not my bill, but I was actually appointed, because of my subcommittee position, appointed to serve on the task force. I think its first meeting, which I hope will be live streamed, I actually don't know, because I'm not the chair of the committee, but the first meeting, I believe, is, I think, either this week or next week. I'll have to check my calendar on that. But so that's kicking off. And then broadly, there's this issue on a number of these zoning issues. Is it actually the province of the state to weigh in on these issues, or is zoning something that's best left to local governments? And at what point should the state intervene? There's also been a number of bills about the speed in which the development process occurs. As y'all probably know, this was related to a bill that Senator Kramer put in, my own senator, my favorite senator, put in this past session on the Maryland National Capital Park and Planning Commission. And that bill ended up being turned into a work group that I believe Delegate Leslie Lopez is heading up. And I think they're still having meetings now about exactly what kind of work product is going to come out of that. I'm not on that committee, so I have to admit I don't know what the current status of it is, but my understanding is there's going to be some sort of legislation emanating from that. The other thing to keep in mind is that, as y'all probably know, any local bills that are put in by the state legislature, in other words, bills that only affect Montgomery County, that deadline is actually sooner. It's around Halloween. I think it's November 1st. And then those bill hearings will be held in Rockville in December. So that's another thing to keep in mind. But I think broadly, other bills you may see in the housing area that I think we've seen in other states that might come before my subcommittee are things like, housing targets. Does it make sense to impose housing targets on certain counties or municipalities that are not meeting goals? In other words, if some counties are building a fair amount of housing and other counties are shrinking and they're not building anything, is there a role for the state to play to essentially try to make counties play fair and take on their own share of the housing burden, if you will? I think that's something that has been kicked around. I think the development process is something that's been kicked around. I also think that the speed of the development process as it relates to certain types of projects is something that's on people's radar, including actually my own. So I had a bill this past session that would have basically said that if a county already has an expedited development review process for some types of projects, then houses of worship, so religious organizations, should be able to benefit from that expedited review if they're building affordable housing on their own land. This idea of churches building affordable housing on their own land, kind of like the adaptive reuse idea, has been attractive to me, because especially after the pandemic, we've seen church attendance, for better or for worse, decline. And so you have these sort of oversized churches who have supersized parking lots. They may have built it in the 80s or 90s when they had larger attendance. People are not going in person to church as much. They have all this space. They're not paying a whole lot in taxes. They don't pay property taxes. So they want to stay, and they want to stay in the community. They've been there for decades. They have these beautiful historic buildings, but they're trying to find a way to stay. And one way that they found as a possibility is adding a few housing units onto maybe extra space they have in their existing facilities as a way not only to kind of booster or bolster their financial outlooks, but also fulfill their social justice missions of providing housing to the least fortunate. The problem is, this process is so fraught and so complex for churches that it's not always feasible for them to do that. And so we're looking at ways that maybe we can make it easier for certain types of nonprofits to build housing for the poor, basically. And so let's see. I think I will wrap up there because I want to make sure that we all have ample time for questions. But that is kind of the bird's eye view of some of the issues that we've tackled in my subcommittee before, some of the issues that I've personally tried to tackle broadly. I mean, I just believe that everybody should be able to have an affordable place to live, but at the same time, we have so many different considerations about every acre of land that we have, and we've got to find a way for it to all work together. We've got to take into account the opinions of existing residents. We've got to be able to account for any growth that are coming in the community. We can't have roads that are overburdened, especially given our concerns about climate change. So we have all make this work. We have to make commuting times work with carbon emissions. We have to make housing affordability work with quality of life. And it's a really, really complex issue. And we have to weigh all these different factors. That's what makes it fun. That's why I find this issue so interesting and why I'm so happy to be on the subcommittee chairing it. But we've dealt with all these issues in the past. These issues are going to be continuing to be at the forefront of the General Assembly's work going forward. So that's kind of the bird's eye view. But honestly, I'm really more interested to hear from y'all on what your perspectives are and the kinds of things that we should be looking at. So yeah, with that, I'll shut up. It's been awesome.
Thank you, Delegate Stewart. You've got fodder for many questions, but to continue at the 30,000-foot level before our delegates and guests ask questions. And I have two questions. One is, what do you think the thinking was to combine ethics and land use as in the committee's agenda? That's the first thing. And the second thing is, in looking at the subcommittees of environment and transportation, I know that you've got one subcommittee that has the bi-county agencies as part of their agenda, and wondering whether or not the issues that some of us have, questions that we have about MNC, PPC, and maybe WSSC, which are bi-county commissions, are best addressed to that committee, or is there some overlap between land use and ethics and that other committee?
Yeah, both are really good questions. So first, the history of the committee. The Environment and Transportation Committee used to be called for a long time the Environmental Matters Committee, and it used to only have like 2 or 3 committees. But I think it was reorganized, I think in 05 or 06, and they basically they created a new committee called the Agriculture, or I think it was the Natural Resources and Ethics Subcommittee. So initially, ethics was paired with natural resources broadly. But then in 2014, that committee was just getting really busy because a lot of the agricultural stuff had been put in there too. And so they pushed, and also land use policies, especially I think in the aftermath of the Glendenning era, were more like, they came up a lot more in the state legislature. And so those topics got busy. And so in an interest to sort of equalize the work across subcommittees, they pulled that out and created a new land use and ethics subcommittee. But also, I think that they paired those two intentionally, because I think especially at the time and even now, there were a lot of valid concerns about making sure that the land use and development process was transparent, open, and as resistant to conflicts of interest and ethical entanglements as possible. So I do think that there's an obvious overlap between the two. Historically, I think that was part of the reason they were put together, but I think they were mostly workload concerns. Now, as to your second question, obviously I'm happy to talk about whatever y'all want to talk about, including parking planning and WSSC, but it is true that those issues tend to go to the other local government subcommittee. I do not believe we're going to be assigned either of Senator Kramer's park and planning bills last session. If I recall, I think those both were going to go to the local, and I'm also not even on the bi-county agency committee in the Montgomery County delegation either. I'm also on the housing. I'm now on the housing and transportation or whatever the subcommittee committee is in the local delegation as well. That said, don't let that stop you. Feel free to throw whatever questions that you want at me. But yeah, I think it's accurate to say that most of the bills that are squarely focused on park and planning are not going to end up in my subcommittee because of that local government subcommittee's jurisdiction.
Thank you very much for those answers. We've got 3 people raising their hands. I'd ask the rest of our guests and delegates, if you'd like to ask a question, to use the raise hand function, which you can find under the reactions icon on the bottom of your screen. And we'll turn first to our treasurer, Jerry Garson, to ask his question of Delegate Stewart.
My question for Delegate Stewart, thank you for coming and attending our session. We see, is there adequate public facilities requirements being met with all the additional housing being proposed in the county? We see major backups on the Beltway almost every weekend, even when it's raining or not raining. And how are we going to get adequate public facilities on the weekend where they don't even measure adequate public facilities on the weekend? All these theories, well, basically only on Monday through Friday in the morning and evening rush hour, and we see that's a minor.
Yeah, well, this is a great question, Jerry. Thank you. So first of all, I will say that the adequate public facilities ordinance is a county proposal. So that's not something that the state legislature has historically been involved with. But I mean, my own 2 cents is that obviously we have issues of overcrowding in certain schools, not all of them. It's a little bit uneven. And I know that there was an effort, obviously, a few years ago to think about rebalancing school districts as a way to try to reduce some overcrowding. That's a fraught issue that's controversial for obvious reasons. But I think it's very clear that given the number of trailers that we have in some schools, it's untenable. That the legislature has tried to combat this with a bill a couple of years ago called the Built to Learn Act, which was by far the largest investment in school buildings in state history. That money has not all gone out yet, and so I'm hopeful that would have an impact. But especially with the rise of gun violence that we've seen and the importance of having secure facilities. I've got a 5-year-old and a 6-month-year-old. My son missed the age cutoff by a week, but he'll be in MCPS kindergarten next year, and it makes me really nervous as a parent in the school system that he would be in a trailer that has less than great security in it. And so I worry a lot about overcrowding, and certainly as someone who commutes every day on 270, I worry about the traffic. And so I think the answer is probably that we don't have adequate public facilities from a road, a transit, or a school's perspective. And so how do we account for that with growing population? Well, I mean, number one, I think we've got to make sure that if we're going to be building new housing, we've got to build it in the right areas. It's going to provide the least stress on our transit system as possible. I'm not sure that sprawling out more housing in greenfield developments, in the northern part, outer reaches of the county is necessarily the solution to that, or in areas that are extremely low density now. I think we have to be smart about where this stuff goes if we're going to build new housing. And when we promise communities that they're going to be transportation amenities when we approve new housing, we need to actually make good on that. There's a lot of different communities where people moved into neighborhoods because they were promised new transit lines or new roads or new schools, and that never developed. And I think that kind of bait and switch naturally fosters hostility, and for good reason. But as it pertains to exactly what the right mix is in terms of the adequate public facility ordinance, I would probably punt and refer you to someone on the county level who knows more about that issue specifically.
Excuse my dog for barking in the background. The next question, down at Conway, then we'll go to Ian, then we'll go to Peggy, and then we'll go to Ira. I saw that, Ira, you added a question in the chat, but please feel free to ask it. So the next person was Diana.
Thank you. And thanks, Delegate Stewart, for joining us tonight. Thanks to the Civic Fed for hosting you and continuing to bring in topical, substantive speakers. So Kathy Michaels just put into the chat a bit of the substance of my question, which is, in addition to the PCBs, which is a decades older known issue like asbestos, As you're well aware, PFAS, the chemical from Teflon and from firefighting foam, is rampant and resulting in 3M saying they're going to quit making it by 2025, $10 billion settlements with communities that have been dumped on the way yours was, and shocking rates of cancer of the kidney, and as my doctor friend tells me to put it, cancer of the testicle, to get the men's attention, among firefighters, because their firefighting foam, their turnout gear is loaded with the stuff. And recently the firefighter unions nationally tried to get the industry to take it out and find an alternative. And, industry is wealthy and powerful, and they were able to beat it back. So I think, Kathy Michaels and I and Sheldon Fishman and others who are on here, and Peggy Dennis and others have worked for a while on synthetic turf, which it turns out is loaded with anywhere from 1 to 38 pounds of PFAS per field. 38 pounds of PFAS, and they're saying 1 drop per Olympic-sized pool is the maximum limit for drinking water safety, according to the EPA. And that's only because that's as low as they can measure it. So I long-winded way of asking what the state can do to not only cut back on civic, exposure of citizens and help the water systems try to figure out how to clean it. I think you may know Poolsville recently had to close 2 of only 13 municipal wells because of excessive PFAS contamination. And I love the word excessive. Like, there's okay PFAS contamination, and then there's excessive.
Yeah.
So anything that you can address that, and specifically, putting in these 2 acres of PFAS on top of, for our kids to roll in every day from pre-K through college, possibly. Thank you.
Thank you, Diane. I appreciate it. So I'll just lay my cards on the table on this one. I am a self-proclaimed or, self-admitted radical on some of these toxins issues. So I've had a couple of bills. We successfully, the bill goes into effect literally on October the 1st. In 3 weeks, we successfully banned coal tar pavement sealers in Maryland. So these are basically, when you put the sealant on a driveway or a parking lot, they make it shiny. It's almost like lip gloss for a parking lot or a driveway. But there are 2 types. They're asphalt-based and they're coal tar-based. And they really work about the same. Practitioners sometimes prefer one or the other, depending on their taste or preferences. They cost about the same. But until recently, Maryland allowed coal tar-based to be used. The problem with this is that coal tar is a hyper carcinogen. And there are studies that suggest that children who grow up next to, especially in like these townhouse communities where you live right next to a parking lot, children that grow up next to parking lots or driveways that have been paved with coal tar sealants have a 38 times increased risk of developing cancer. So it's really bad news. We finally got that done. Shout out to Senator Kagan, who was our crossfire on that. But I've been someone who as Diana was very strongly in favor of a bill that we finally passed about how we basically having a chain of custody and rules, very, very basic rules for turf fields. I hope that bill is really the start of a larger conversation on that issue. For me, that's about as low-hanging a fruit as you get. For the benefit of everyone else, essentially, not only do we have these toxic turf fields, the state had no oversight process whatsoever about how we disposed of them. So we were essentially allowing these disposal companies to come in and rip these bad boys out and just dump them wherever they want. If it was near a stream, whatever. If it was in a tributary of the bay, whatever. If it was near another school where it could go into the drinking water, we had no rules in place. We were just completely reliant on these corporate entities, these corporate turf folks or whatever, to say, oh, they were figuring out, they had best practices or whatever. And then they came into our committee like 3 or 4 years in a row because we kept failing to pass this bill. And they kept coming in, and I was one of the members of the committee that were asking questions about what these rules were and how often they were followed. And it was just laughable because they were never able to answer the questions. I mean, it was one of the worst, testimony performances that we would hear every year. And that finally cost them in the form of this bill. But I think that, it's hopefully only the start. I mean, I think we need to take a much larger look at whether or not turf fields make sense in a broader context when you're talking about school children. Now, if they want to have it in Atlanta for the Falcons, or if they want to have it in Indianapolis for the Colts or whatever, that's fine. Those are probably going to be turf fields that are going to be maintained up to an extremely high level. I worry more about MCPS. They've got a lot of other financing difficulties to worry about and a number of other priorities. It's not a for-profit business, right? And so I worry about their quality and whether the maintenance of those fields are going to be on par with the Indianapolis Colts maintenance. And I worry about
It's not. I can tell you that.
Yeah,
it
yeah.
ain't.
So I worry about that, what
literally
that means for our
failing.
kids. Yeah, in terms not only in terms of toxicity, but also in terms of injuries, which I think the science is still out on. But I just say broadly, in the interest of me trying to be a little bit more brief, I believe in the precautionary principle about these toxins. So whether we're talking about PFAS and whether we're talking about coal tar or whatever, I think the view is and long been in state legislatures around the country. Let's make sure the science is clear before we ban anything. So in other words, before we disrupt industry profits, let's make sure all the studies are in and we're 100% sure that something is unsafe. I don't think that works. I don't think that that's a pro-health view. I think we need to take a precautionary principle where anytime that there is risk, legitimate studies, even if there are studies on both sides, if there is any risk out there that we're talking about children getting cancer, I just think it's really difficult to put a high enough price on the value of that. And then we need to press pause on a lot of these different technologies, substances, pesticides, etc., where there is real substantive evidence that we are poisoning people. And I don't know if that makes me radical, it makes me radical, but that's my take on it. I appreciate all of y'all's advocacy on these issues.
Well, that's why we love you, and that was an important priority for the Civic Federation. But please clarify this for me. Did we pass the low-hanging fruit of that chain of custody bill?
I don't think it actually passed the Senate. We finally passed it in the House. It did not make it through the Senate. So
it sailed out of the House with a 3-1 vote,
yeah.
and landed at the committee that Brian Feldman now chairs. And my personal take is that the Senate president told the new chairman of his new EEE committee that it was not to be brought to a vote. And apparently that happened several times, even though I'm told the votes were there by a number of various senators.
Yeah, I should have clarified. When I say we, I'm only talking about the House. I don't speak for the Senate. They're not part of the we. So, but yeah, I mean, we finally passed it in the House. It took us a long time to even pass a strong bill out of the House. Usually the Senate is a few years behind. So it was sad not to just not see that bill pass after crossover. We kind of all in the House were high-fiving. We honestly just thought it was a done deal. We were naive. But I'm confident we'll eventually get done. We just kind of have to, everybody, if you care about this issue, everybody on the call, we need to just keep ramping up the pressure on the Senate, because now that that's a done deal in the House, that bill will come over to them, probably by early February. And then they're going to, either sit on it for 2 months or do the right thing.
Thank you for that clarification. It was a priority, is a priority, and we'll be supporting your work and other like-minded delegates when this issue gets reintroduced in the next General Assembly. Ian Feller.
Yes, hello. My name is Ian Feller. I'm from the Woodside neighborhood of Silver Spring. Thank you, Delegate Stewart, for coming. I appreciate your thoughtful discussion. This is actually my first meeting here, period. So this has actually been a really great introduction for me. Wanted to just talk about the conversion of commercial buildings into the residential housing. And I totally can understand how, especially for high vacancy buildings, with folks not coming back to work in the same way, with a lot of companies moving out, I could see that being a great way to increase supply, thereby lowering prices of housing, maybe even increasing potential affordable units. But I've read a lot about issues regarding water conversion, specifically like bathrooms and water facilities in some of these buildings can be really expensive to convert, and potentially means that things may not always be the right fit. And so just wondering, it may work better with some buildings than others. And just curious, if you or others have been thinking through this issue, and if you have any thoughts, and if you haven't, I would just ask, maybe think about it, because, some of these can be incredibly expensive and ultimately maybe not worthwhile.
Yeah, and thank you, Ian, and welcome to the group. I guess I hope this is a good representation for everyone. I'm not spoiling it for the entire Civic Fed and scare you off, but So you're 100% right. And, the problem with adaptive reuse is it can be incredibly expensive. And I think, even in the probably, I would even go so far as to say not only the majority, but maybe the vast majority of cases, it's more expensive to keep the building generally than just to tear it all down and rebuild something else, which is, in my view, a tragedy. Now, it depends on the age of the building, as you referenced. So buildings built in the 70s and 80s tend to do a little bit better, and even before that tend to do even better. So when you look at a place like Baltimore City that has older buildings, it's probably a better candidate than a lot of parts of Montgomery County in terms of some of these office conversions. There's also the problem of there's a lot of space in the interior of these commercial buildings that don't get natural light. We obviously have hallways, interior hallways in residential buildings. They're not built, the bones are not built in the same way in office buildings. And as a result, you've got a problem where when you try to make it profitable for developers to repurpose these buildings, you have this problem where you've got units that don't have sunlight exposure to bedrooms, for example. And that's something that a lot of state legislatures and county councils and city councils are now addressing, whether or not they should open up the possibility, for example, of windowless bedrooms. I'm honestly kind of torn on this issue because on the one hand, the pricing that I was thrown out there was if we allowed this, something like 3 or 4 times more of these buildings could be converted. I worry about the future of our downtown areas if these vacancy rates persist. Ira Unger, I know, asked in the chat about the vacancy rate. My understanding is that the residential vacancy rate right now in Montgomery County is less than 5%. It's like 4.5, but the commercial vacancy rate is something like 15 or 16. Now that's come down in the aftermath of COVID. I think it was like 20 or 30. I may be off. You don't quote me. I'm being a little bit off on the numbers, but generally the commercial vacancy rates are going to be 3 or 4 times higher than your residential vacancy rates post-COVID in most areas. So, given that, it's a solution that I really hope that we can try to pursue, but, we're probably going to have to be somewhat flexible on these rules. We're going to have to decide, there are definitely going to be people that would live in places with the windowless bedrooms. Now, that doesn't mean the whole thing is without sunlight. It's just maybe sunlight's coming into the kitchen. Is that something we're okay with as a society, someone paying $2,200 a month for a bedroom with a window, but maybe, $1,400 for a unit with now I have blackout shades, so maybe I'm biased from a personal standpoint. I don't like the sun coming in the morning. I'm not sure what my mental health prospects would be if I never had the sun in my bedroom, right? But those are the kinds of tough decisions that we might have to weigh going forward. But to your point, Ian, and the other thing that I've been talking about, I'm talking to Secretary Day, the new DHCD secretary, about is, do we have any funding in the budget for this? Does it make sense as a state priority to throw dollars at these projects, especially when we're dealing with historic buildings? Does it make sense for us to throw money to make these conversions more doable, to make them pencil out? Or is that throwing bad money or good money after bad in some way? And are we better off just letting these buildings get torn down? But again, for whatever reason, I guess I'm a masochist. I've chosen the toughest possible issues in my view to tackle, but this is another one that's really thorny. And in a lot of these cases, there are no easy answers. I don't think that, there's no silver bullet on any of this stuff. You have to think really critically and you have to weigh all sides, except for PFAS. That you don't have to weigh all sides there.
Right. Well, thank you very much for that.
And thank you, Ian, for joining us from Woodside. We love Woodside. We've got a couple of other questions. If anybody's got questions, please raise your hand or put them in the chat. Delegate Stewart, it's been good to look at the chat. Peggy, why don't we take you? You're first on my screen, and then Ira right after that. Peggy?
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, goody, I've done it right. Diana Conway said it all about the problems with forever chemicals on synthetic turf playing fields. Injuries were brought up. I would bring up a third big negative with SynTurf fields, and that is climate change. I know Governor Moore is very keen on reining in things that contribute to global warming, and every single synthetic turf field is a heat sink. They get so hot they cannot be used during the summer, and they remain hot throughout the evening and night. So that's one more thing. Would it be useful if we could meet with Governor Moore and get him behind us and get him working on some of the senators in opposition to reining in sin turf fields. What do you think?
I don't think it would hurt to try to reach out to the governor's office and talk to some of his people. I mean, just in terms of legislative strategy. And by the way, I'm obviously with you 100%. And you've done a great job of testifying in my committee before. So I'm with you. I mean, in terms of just pure legislative strategy, it's never going to hurt to ask for a meeting with the governor's team. I just don't know whether or not they've obviously got a million other things going on, whether they'll take it or not. But if you can get a meeting before somebody on the legislative team there, do it. There's no downside of doing that meeting. I mean, I think that what we've seen in this past session is this administration, you're right, is very, very sensitive to climate issues. I think they're very sensitive towards issues of environmental justice just broadly. But I also think that, you know, the governor is in a lot of ways still getting his sea legs. I think could be potentially reluctant to be too heavy-handed about telling either the Senate president or the speaker what bills to pass. Now, obviously, he does that on some issues, but, you know, you want to make nice with people. And so you don't necessarily want to tell these legislative leaders when you're the new guy on the block and they've been down there for more than a decade, you know, 20 years each at least. You want to make friends and not enemies, right? So you don't want to necessarily boss them around on every issue. So what I would say is get a meeting with the governor if you can. Don't necessarily count on him doing any lobbying for that, even if he personally is with us on this issue. I would focus more of your attention on the Senate.
Thank you for that answer. Ira?
Hi, Vaughn. Nice to see you.
Good to see you. You didn't have to come to this. You could have asked me to grab a cup of coffee if you wanted.
Will do. So listen, there's all these issues, and in general, you know, I keep wondering why we live. And I've only been coming here a dozen years or so to these meetings, but we live in a progressive, wealthy county, which should be the model for the rest of the country, and we're not doing it. It seems in so many ways. I mean, these synthetic fields. We went over this and over at meetings years ago, describing all the problems, and and we know how to do grass fields. It's not like we need this stupid technology. What has gone, and that's just one of the three issues I wanted to address, but what has gone wrong with why we haven't gotten to pass it? My sense is that there's a lot of money and they present very well in session. The corporate interest.
Well, one of those is right. One of those is right.
Okay.
They have a lot of money. I'm not sure, as I said before, I'm not sure if they present very
well
in public during session.
Why is Montgomery County still putting in all these synthetic fields for our children? I don't get it.
Well, that's a good question, right? I mean, this speaks to the difference between the state legislature and the county government, right?
And in our little Camp Mill Park, we're little kids, they put in synthetic foam, and we had the head of parks come, and he said, no, they're fine.
I know. It is strange to me for exactly the reason. I don't really have an answer, sadly, but I think that you're right, that Montgomery County on a lot of environmental issues has been way ahead of the curve. In fact, on the coal tar bill that I just brought up, Montgomery County passed a coal tar ban like 15 years ago before the state did. And that's generally the pattern you see, is that the county is willing to move. And then, Annapolis, the state legislative leaders sort of sneer at our county, by the way. They make fun of us. And they say, Montgomery County.
Because we're so progressive, you mean?
Montgomery County is doing some weird thing again or whatever. And then a decade passes, and then the weird thing Montgomery County was doing is actually clearly the right thing. And then Maryland ends up following the lead as a state, but only after like 6 or 7 states do it. So I don't know why this is not one of those issues that Montgomery County has led on. I would certainly think that our odds in terms of an absolute ban on putting this at least on new fields or new playgrounds, I would think that our odds of passing that are way higher on a county level basis first than a state level basis, But your guess is as good as mine why this idea has not captured the imagination of the county like some other issues have around pesticides or whatever.
Right. Let's go to another issue of affordable housing, which is, I think, a crisis in this county. And we still are not really doing so much for the poorest, for our most vulnerable people, to give them affordable housing. It doesn't seem to me. And I don't think the welfare department is really treating people with dignity either in general. But the problem with, of course, government housing was it would get ghettoized and become a crime area, et cetera, et cetera. Right. So I'm not sure where the vacancy rate has to be before it's better to build new rather than to make it affordable within existing housing. How do you analyze the situation?
Yeah, I mean, my view about our housing crisis in Montgomery County. Well, first of all, I mean, in terms of the share of the population in the state that has trouble, that is basically what you'd call rent burden or housing burden, where they're spending upwards of a third of their income
Right, right.
on housing. Montgomery County laps the rest of the state. This is by far a bigger issue here than it is in other parts of the state. Even when I bring up the affordable housing crisis in Annapolis, sometimes legislators from the Baltimore area even give me kind of a weird look because they have a number of their own problems. But in their view, the cost of housing is not really the issue to them. It's much more affordable up there, even when you adjust for cost of living or incomes or anything. So it's a really distinctly it's a problem in some cities. So it's a problem in the DC area for sure. It's a problem in San Francisco. It's a problem in New York. It's a rising problem in other parts.
Yeah, but here we can't have our police and our teachers live here because it's too expensive.
Yeah, I know exactly. And I mean, I've knocked on, a lot of doors in District 19 and not too far from where you live, Ira, where people are like, we're moving, my wife works for the school. She teaches social studies in this middle school nearby. And we're going to Frederick County or we're going to Howard County. And that's a shame. I mean, I think that every time that happens, it's a legitimate travesty and tragedy to have someone who is teaching our students, who is fighting our fires, who is protecting our streets, who can't even afford to live, even with a dual income, in the county they teach or they police or whatever. So we've got to do a better job. My view is this is a complex enough issue that we've got to throw a lot of different darts at the board here.
I mean, Natalie just introduced, rent control, which is fantastic. Finally,
yeah, we did do rent control. I'm hopeful that that'll sort of help move the needle. Now, the trick here with the sort of ghettoized public housing, as you said, the trick here is that you sort of have to do this in a way that doesn't fall under the same problems that we saw these housing complexes in places like Chicago and St. Louis fall under. Now, that type of public housing was a clear public policy failure in all ways. And it was really set up to be because those housing projects were government financed, they were publicly owned. That wasn't why they failed. They failed because they were intentionally located away from jobs and opportunity. They were trying to warehouse undesirable people in their mind who they did not want to live near jobs and opportunity and good schools. They saw the public housing projects a way to take huge numbers of them and place them away out of sight, out of mind. And then they only housed the very poor in those buildings. And then, of course, they didn't build them very well and they didn't do maintenance because the people in the building didn't have any political power. So the way you do it, and this may sound fanciful to sort of the American ear, but this is how basically you mentioned sort of international examples. This is how the rest of the world does housing, is they have publicly owned housing along with private sector housing. Obviously, we're never going to get to the point where public housing is even 10% of the housing stock. No one's proposing that. But there's a role for both the public and the private sector. But the public sector housing is mixed income. So, and the way you are able to get wealthier people to move in to cross-subsidize the rents of the poorer people is that you actually make it housing that people want. So it's located in good areas. It's located in places with good schools, and it's beautiful. There are a lot of these social public housing projects in Europe that have won architectural design awards.
So your suggestion then is the government would be the actual landlord?
Yeah, well, HOC is already doing this. So this is one thing that Montgomery County has led on, is that the Housing Opportunities Commission has become a national leader in building public mixed income housing. In fact, I will, if y'all haven't seen it already, I will put a link into the chat because the New York Times actually just did a great article on what HOC is doing. And it's funny. The title is called "This is Public Housing, Just Don't Call It That." And that speaks to sort of the stigma around the term public housing. But I'll put that on the chat. If you guys need a free link to that, just email me afterwards and I'll gift you a link if you don't have a New York Times subscription. But it's a really good article about what's happening in our own backyard, and it's clearly not enough to solve the problem on its own. Like, no one is suggesting that HOC is going to sort of take this under its own hand and do everything, right? But they're doing a really good job, and so much so that we've had visitors now from 7 different states come into Montgomery County to see how they can replicate that. So one of my missions on the state level is 4 counties like Montgomery County's HOC that are doing inventive things like this, that are clearly working and we're getting national attention for. How can the state support that? Not in a heavy-handed way of preemption or whatever, but how can we put some money on the line for innovative counties that are willing to kind of go outside the box and try to take novel solutions to persisting, vexing problems?
All right. I mean, Alan, I'm hogging a lot of time. You can yank me if you want.
No, that's fine, because this is one of the issues that's dominated our conversations over the last couple of years. We've posted a New York Times article from August 25th on our Facebook page
good.
because we thought it was an important article. It, raises, well, Chris Reynolds wanted to make this point, put in the chat that, rent control is not going to help us get more housing. And I think that that's an important reality to sort of address. And I think one of the takeaways from the New York Times article is that if you're going to try to put a dent in the large number of affordable housing units that this county is going to need over the next 50 years, a lot of that's going to come from public finance. I mean, public private development is not going to solve the issue of tens of thousands of affordable units, and raising the question, what more can the state do to provide resources to the county? What more can the federal government do, provide resources to the state so you can build more housing of the kind that I saw developed in the 1960s? A lot of the senior buildings in northern New Jersey are from, HUD programs. I know that the president had suggested, billions of dollars for affordable housing in one of his bills that didn't pass. But I think that's the direction that we need to go, and we need to encourage our state lawmakers and our county legislators to think more about public financing of affordable housing. The MBDU program is not going to do it at 12.5%. And so there's proposals, to move it to 15, 20%. At that point, though, there's a tipping point where, the developers are not going to do projects, if they're not required to do 15 or 20%. Chris says public housing is great. HOC is great. There isn't the public money to build at the scale to solve the problem. Yeah, that was my point, Chris. And so that's something that we may advocate for. So Ira,
and Chris, I think that's exactly right. I mean, there's no question that I think that sometimes people use, public housing as an excuse to not look at what the private sector needs to do or where new housing needs to be built from the private sector. And that's certainly not what I'm trying to do, is play rhetorical games there. I do think we also shouldn't just wave our hands and just give up on the idea that we're not going to have enough public funding. We're not going to ever have, just true, we're never going to have public funding to solve the problem solely with public housing at scale. But I also don't think that we should prematurely give up on trying to get more funding for something that is so important. I mean, everybody, no matter what your perspective on this issue is, and Alan very well said, everybody believes that having a home should be a fundamental human right. The idea that there should be a roof over everybody's head, that, it just relates to so many other issues. How can students learn if they have housing instability? I was just thinking about this the other day on such a, sort of rich people problem sort of issue. But I came back from a vacation the other day and our AC unit was broken. My kindergartner was starting kindergarten on Wednesday when we got back from a trip, and our AC didn't work. So we got to go spend a couple of nights in a hotel. And it was a nice hotel. We had a couple free nights at Marriott. I'm not complaining at all. It wasn't that big of a deal. But it made me think, man, this is really disruptive to our routine. And my son didn't sleep. He's having to start kindergarten and out of this new environment. And it was really disruptive. And I couldn't help but think about all the families that are evicted multiple times a year, or that have to change schools every single year. And I actually have very briefly, that reminds me, and now we can move on, but very briefly reminds me, I do have a bill. I want to create a housing rental assistance funding specifically for families that if they get evicted, they would have to leave their school districts. This is a new topic around the Kerwin Blueprint funding for community schools. There are going to be now all this new state funding for what they call community schools that have wraparound services for students. So this is going to be a place where not only students can get fresh food, but their whole families are going to have access to fresh food. Not only the students will get dental and health care at these schools, their whole families will get medical care. But which is awesome. It's a great model. It recognizes that what happens in the classroom is influenced by what happens outside the classroom. The problem is what we haven't thought about on the state level is, what if a family gets evicted from a private unit in a community school zone? Now, not only do they lose their support system, they lose their favorite teacher, they lose their friend group. That's already happening. Now their whole family is going to lose their health care. they're going to lose their access to fresh fruits and vegetables because they got evicted. So we can't allow that to happen. I mean, that's going to be a huge, not only just black eye for the state, but I think a morally depraved situation. So that's another bill I didn't mention that I'm going to put forward, but we need to create an emergency rental assistance fund. Even if we don't get any more money from Joe Biden, we need to have a state one that's at least, even if it's not, I would rather target it larger, obviously, but at least a relatively small and lean fund just targeted to families who would otherwise be evicted from community school zones.
One of the issues I just want to point out to everybody's attention is that the issues of more public support for housing and climate change have not been part of the debate for people who are running for U.S. Senate. They're not talking about more state funding for housing. They're not really talking about climate change solutions. So, please ask them to address those issues. Eric Cathcart, you've got a question.
I don't know if it's a question, but it's more of a statement of exactly where we are regarding housing. One of the bigger pickles in my community is vacant housing. We seem to be a model of a model community of having a 5% vacancy rate in our community, and that means we've got 5% of our houses in our community are vacant for a number of reasons. And there's absolutely no, and this is not at the state level, but it's probably at the local level. We have no policy or vacancy tax in Montgomery County to motivate property owners to either fix up their houses and sell them or rent them. And there's not a thing I can do as a civic leader, because my bylaws bind me to represent even the deadbeat property owners, as much as I don't want to, but I have to. And it's very frustrating. So I've created a subcommittee of citizens, and they're tasked to make a lot of noise at the county level. But it's very frustrating, as I'm sharing with the other civic leaders here our situation. But if you think about affordable housing we've got 5% of Montgomery County has vacant homes in communities like mine in downtown Silver Spring that's absolutely perfect, and they are affordable homes. So that's just a point. And then going back to synthetic turf, I am by profession, I'm an event producer. I'm an event person, and about 10 or 14 years ago, I used to work for a national company, and we sold event flooring. So I was the seller of turf and carpet, and our company would sell $1 million worth of artificial turf for Super Bowl. And at the end of the day, after the event, after the Super Bowl's over, it all goes into the dumpster and it goes off to somewhere else. And I spoke to our manufacturers in Dalton, Georgia, many times about this. So you have to you have to really look at which end of the horse you're talking to. The manufacturers will say, yeah, we're responsible, we're putting out a good product, but it's the installers that are adding the fill rubber because they can make more of a margin on that. So they're going against what the manufacturers are suggesting. And then instead of yelling at the sellers and yelling at or going after the manufacturers, I think we should be in talking about chain of custody. It's really incumbent on the purchaser to do the right thing after they purchase the product and how they are going to dispose of it. So I think that if Montgomery County is ripping up turf fields at the end of the day, and then they're hiring a contractor to get rid of it, well, I think it's Montgomery County, it's the buyers. I think it's the buyer's responsibility to be the responsible party, not the manufacturer, not the seller. But I'm just sharing with you this insight that really drove me crazy. I mean, we did all of the red carpet for Hollywood, and a quarter mile of red carpet. At the end of the event, somebody ripped it up and somebody put it in the dumpster. Yeah. But it wasn't our fault. and it wasn't the manufacturer's fault. And you have to look at the product. Where is it coming from? Is it coming from Dalton, or is it coming from China? So, it's complicated, but you really need to know when you're having a conversation with the manufacturers, where their head's at.
Yeah, no, that's very helpful on terms of the number of different parties you have. It's something that makes the issue, inherently more complex. But I think that's very helpful context. And then, I mean, to your first point about the vacancy rate, it's also a good point. I mean, I'm not opposed to something like a vacancy tax. I will say that, sometimes I think people, one of the sort of fake solutions to the housing crisis sometimes bring up is like, oh, we have all this vacant housing. They use a statistic for like the United States as a whole, and they say, oh, 10% of housing units are vacant. What if we just found a way to make it harder for people to hold on to second homes, or hold it harder to, for private equity companies to gobble up housing and not rent it out? And we instead forced, them to give that housing out. Well, of the 5%, so you got to remember some of those are actually in transition homes where maybe someone has passed away and the house is on the market and it's technically vacant because no one lives there, but it's in the process of being sold. Some of those are second homes. I mean, I think the state seizing second homes is probably not something that's on the realistic policy agenda anytime soon. But you're right that of the 5%, some fraction of it would be, corporate entities that are just kind of holding homes. And I don't like that. If there's a way that we could sort of force them to rent it out, I'm in favor of it. But I would hesitate to say that it's going to really move the needle in a place like Montgomery County, where you do have relatively tight margins. For vacancy rates. But and also, of course, a lot of the vacant homes nationwide are in places like Wyoming, and we don't want to force a bunch of poor Montgomery County residents to move to Wyoming or something, right? So it's a thorny issue. But I appreciate both comments.
We're going to go to Kathy Michaels. You want to try to get that together? We'll go to Ira first.
Well, I wanted to continue with the question I posed on the chat, which is, how are we doing with housing and climate change? We had a lot of talk about that a few years ago here. I don't think our measures are as good as Europe's. And can you talk about that a little bit, Vaughn? Are you familiar with how we're doing in terms of climate?
Yeah, so I had a bill on this a couple of years ago to basically require retrofitting of old, large residential and commercial buildings to retrofit, especially commercial, to retrofit them to make them more to basically cut emissions. The nice thing about this policy solution is that not only can you massively cut emissions in most metropolitan areas, including in Montgomery County and in the Baltimore region, it's actually buildings that are the number one source of emissions. Now, statewide, it's transportation. But when you zero in on urban-ish areas, buildings are the number one source of emissions. So not only is it a way to dramatically cut your carbon emissions, it also, you can build a lot of good paying jobs in the process. So at a time where we're still concerned with wage stagnation and we've got, Bidenomics, industrial policy, or whatever, we're trying to put people back to work and union wages, retrofitting jobs are great skilled labor job. Of course, I think all labor is skilled, but good jobs, good union paying, family sustaining wage jobs. So I had a bill. Eventually, a lot of the language from my bill was tucked into the Climate Solutions Now bill that the legislature passed a year and a half ago. It does have some new retrofit standards for buildings. I wish we would have gone further. Ultimately, we didn't go super far. There was a lot of industry pushback from building owner, commercial building owner folks on this. This is a really, really fraught, politically vicious fight for the last couple of years. It kind of resolved itself because we put together kind of a piecemeal proposal. But, I know Montgomery County has tried to do some inventive things as a county. I think Tom Hucker was leading the charge on a lot of this stuff. Some of that stuff actually was preempted by the state's bill, which was unfortunate. Basically, it was a little bit of a compromise where we're going to set some statewide standards, but we're also going to preempt if counties want to go above what the state wants to do. So that was another sort of tricky part of this. But anyway, to answer your question, no, we're not doing enough. No, we're not remotely comparable to what Europe is doing. No, neither Montgomery County nor Maryland nor the United States of America is meeting the climate goals we need to do to prevent climate disaster. And buildings are a huge part of it. And as such, and to me, one of the lowest hanging fruits part of it, because you can lower utility bills,
Exactly.
cut emissions, and create jobs in one fell swoop. I think there are very few climate policies that have so little downside and so much upside.
Thank you.
I've got a couple questions, Kathy. I think if you turn the volume down on one of those units, you'll be fine. So you're next, Kathy.
Okay, just a quick response. Thank you, Eric, for your note. Well, there were two things I wanted to note. The private, there was an article recently on housing, on how the county could actually step in as the private equity funding partner and create housing that could accommodate people across the income spectrum. I thought that was really, really interesting, and kind of turns the whole private equity vulture part of the equation on its head. So that was one thing I wanted to mention. In addition to the article recently on the moderately priced dwelling units that ROCO pioneered, which I don't know how well it's worked out in practice, but certainly is a great idea and goes along with that, the private equity part of it. And I think there's a downtown Silver Spring. But then the other transitioning back to synthetic turf, just wanted to note there is no safe, non-toxic synthetic turf carpeting. Dalton, Georgia, that Eric mentioned, is an enormous source of PFAS pollution for all the communities downstream, because it's not just synthetic turf, it's all synthetic carpeting. PFAS chemicals are what made synthetic carpeting possible on huge scales. So it is incumbent on people who are buying to become aware of that, because there are no regulations on the manufacturer at this point. As you know, in the US, we don't have a precautionary principle. There's 80,000 and growing chemicals out there. Only 5 of them are actually regulated to any extent. So it's, synthetic plastics in general, synthetic carpeting in particular, are whether it's synthetic turf or other carpeting as well, are a bad idea. And you can't, whether it's China or the US, you're not going to get anything safe. And the disposal, there's no regulations, so they get dumped almost anywhere, which is what the chain of custody was just trying to find out, where it's being disposed of. I mean, almost nowhere in the US is anyone aware where it's actually going, when it doesn't actually go into a landfill, where it's also leaching out PFAS. So, anyway, just
Thanks, Kathy. Jackie?
Last time that Mark Eldridge was on, he mentioned that there were 40,000 housing units that had been approved by the county to be built, but none of them were being built. And whatever that's, I thought he implied that it was because there wasn't enough profit in it for them, for the builders or something. But I want to say is, can there be, if they don't build in a certain amount of time, can they have that rescinded and let somebody else say, let some other developer go in and build it? Because we need those housing units. The prices will never come down if we don't have more units. So am I misunderstanding the situation or not? I don't know, but I'm just wondering why we can't.
I think I can probably speak to what is a great question. I think what he was probably saying is that, I think sometimes the county will approve certain units or basically bank on certain units as part of the development profile or meeting our goals or whatever. And then the developers will sort of pull the rug out at the last second because they can't get financing. I mean, I certainly think that other developers would always have the ability to come in and bring that together. But I mean, I think it just speaks to trying to make the process more streamlined. I mean, I think part of the reason that you see development projects pull out midstream is because the stream is so damn long, and confusing. And this goes to the point of what, Delegate Lopez and Senator Kramer and County Executive Elrich and his team and a lot of people have been trying to, this nut they've been trying to crack over the summer, which is that, do we have processes right now that are duplicative and redundant in our development review process? And if we clean that up, maybe we would get fewer of these developers pulling the rug out from under us and basically promising to build stuff and then it not coming to fruition. But it's certainly an issue. And then I guess I'll just briefly, since several people have mentioned private equity, I'll give a plug. I did pass a bill about mobile home communities and private equity. We only actually have one of these communities in Montgomery Village. We only have one in Montgomery County. They're much more popular throughout the state. We've been seeing this problem with private equity companies, kind of vulture capital companies, come in and they're buying these entire kind of naturally occurring affordable mobile home communities. And they're either jacking up the rent and displacing residents by like 300 or 400%, or they're just turning it into non-housing. And neither are obviously great outcomes. And so we did a bill, kind of a common sense. We got everybody on board. I had a Republican senator who worked on the bill with me, and we passed it unanimously in both chambers, that basically makes it a lot harder and gives the residents the ability to sort of band together to buy homes if there's going to be a bad actor who comes in who's clearly intent on either changing the use of the park or jacking up the rent. And yeah, I mean, I'm just a strong believer that, you know, I guess maybe this is maybe the Alabama in me coming out, but you know, just because you live in a trailer doesn't mean you're trash.
No, we agree. We agree with that. I want to circle back to sort of the subcommittee's jurisdiction and ask the question: do the issues of general plans come before your subcommittee? I mean, the county passes a general plan and then it presented, I guess, it to the State Department of Planning for some kind of approval. I'm wondering whether or not general plans has been on your agenda. And related to that, you mentioned zoning at the outset of your remarks, and wondering, you talked about some of the philosophical issues. Is there any thought to having sort of a state conversation on exclusionary, inclusionary zoning? Are they limited by some kind of division between state and local government? All right, so if you can keep those two things in mind. And the last thing is, one of the questions that comes up often in this group is whether or not MNC PPC should be subjected to the authority of the State Ethics Commission. And we don't believe it is. We think that they're sort of a self-governing agency. So the issue of MNC PPC, WSSC ethics comes up. Is that in the bi-county subcommittee, or does your subcommittee get a piece of it?
Okay, I'll try to remember. My brain can only hold like one or two things. So 3 topics at once is really stressing me. All right, let's see. Number one, general plans. The general plans themselves do not come before the General Assembly in any way for approval or disapproval. However, we as a committee and subcommittee have seen, will see bills affecting what general plans look like and what they have to include. So most notably, Brooke Learman, now our comptroller of the state of Maryland, and she's excellent. She was actually my predecessor. She was the subcommittee chair for the subcommittee that the subcommittee that I chair. I was at that. There was a vacancy in that subcommittee because she left office to resign or to run for comptroller. But she put in a bill mandating that counties include what's called a housing element in their general plan, basically to speak to the amount of affordable housing that exists in a county, the amount of new people they think are going to move in, the amount of new homes they think might need to be built. That was something that was never required before. Now, Montgomery County already had a housing element in its plan, as did several of the larger counties. But some of the smaller counties and some of the big counties just didn't bring that up until that bill passed. So I think that could, that bill passed in 2018 or 2019. There have been a couple of bills since then to sort of tinker around with what counties are required to include in these plans. I think you could see that. I mean, I think the reality is, just broadly on the issue of preemption, going to your next question about what we have the authority to do, the state legislature calls the shots. There's nowhere in the state constitution, the U.S. Constitution, the New or the Old Testament, anything about local governments having the divine right to do zoning. Now, this is a lot of people strongly feel that should be the case, but increasingly, maybe I'm biased because I'm a state legislator. I think it's a really interesting topic of when states should step in on a number of issues. I mean, the reality is the state pumps tons of money between education and transportation and land use and open space and parks and everything into counties. And so at what point, if some counties are not doing the right thing on a whole host of issues, there's always a question of when preemption is appropriate. Just like there's a question of when preemption is appropriate on the federal level. When should the federal government step in and preempt the states? You know, I mean, it's historically my political party in the middle of the 20th century was in favor of preemption, especially as it related to civil rights. And, you know, a lot of people from my home state were not in favor of that same preemption. So I think I don't think that preemption is always appropriate or always inappropriate, but it is true that we definitely have the authority to do it, including on inclusionary zoning. Now, I'm a proponent of inclusionary zoning. If someone wanted to put forward a statewide bill or, you know, a local bill about some other county other than Montgomery, following Montgomery County's, you know, what was in the 70s a groundbreaking approach, I would be a co-sponsor of that bill. I think it's great. But the reality is it has not been a failed experiment. I think that's way too strong. It has been a success, our 12.5 MPDU program, but it hasn't moved the needle enough because we're not building that many new buildings and we're not getting that many affordable units out of each building. And the units that we're deeming affordable aren't really affordable for people at the very bottom of the income spectrum either. So it doesn't hurt. I think it would help. I think it would overall make the state a better place to live and a more affordable place to live for families if we passed a statewide bill. We absolutely have the ability to pass that statewide bill, but I think we need to do it in conjunction with a lot of other different policies if we really care about everyone having an affordable place to lay their head at night. And then the last part of your question about the State Ethics Commission's authority over park and planning, honestly, y'all would know better than me exactly. I mean, park and planning as a state apparatus is an extremely complex area of the code. I mean, I've looked at it, especially, you know, in the aftermath of Senator Kramer's couple of bills. I studied it closely, and I still can't totally figure out who has ethics, who can call the ethics shot. I would agree that historically, the State Ethics Commission has played a very hands-off role with park and planning, which suggests to me they don't think that they have the authority to govern it. I think it's an interesting idea to house it within the State Ethics Commission, though I'm sure that, you know, many county council members would vehemently disagree with me on that and would think that it should just solely rest with the county. And that gets back to these same kind of preemption concerns about whether these decisions should rest at the county or the state level. But, you know, it is interesting. Now, I will say that if that bill was put in, I don't know where it would go. You know, if it's an ethics bill but that deals with a bi-county agency, it could sort of go either way. I would think it would probably go to the local government, but honestly, these decisions about which subcommittees bills are assigned to is not as scientific of a process as you might think. It's more of an art and a science, and it kind of can depend on the mood of the relevant chair or speaker staff. This stuff is a little bit loosey-goosey. You know, these decisions sometimes are made for political reasons. If they want in other words, if the powers that be want a bill to pass, sometimes they put the bill in the committee that they know that the chair likes the bill. And if they don't necessarily want the bill to pass, sometimes it just so magically happens and it ends up in the subcommittee of a chair who doesn't like the bill, right? So this stuff is not necessarily hard and fast. If I had to guess, I'd say it did not come to my subcommittee, but if the powers that be wanted it to pass and they knew that I liked it, maybe it would. Who knows?
That's exactly the question I was asking, and that was a perfect answer for that question. You mentioned the housing element that Montgomery County has, and that the one that was suggested by the comptroller, the present comptroller now, I think we would suggest that there be a community participation element in general plans that are developed at the county level. We had some controversy about how much community participation was involved in the passage of last year's general plan in Montgomery County. I just want to ask you one more question and then we'll let you go. It's already 9 o'clock and we really appreciate you hanging in here and love asking you questions, love hearing your answers. What's your feeling about the public financing of state offices? That's
I'm very supportive. Yeah, I think it's long overdue. I was supportive of the county public financing. I think that it was a little bit rocky off the start with some of the implementation. I think Howard County also had a little bit of the implementation difficulties at starting time. You're enacting something like that, you're always going to have some hiccups. But I think overall it's been a transcendent positive for the county that folks can go to regular people for small dollar donations, and the incentive rather than just sit on the phone for big checks is to actually go meet real people in your neighborhood to get small checks that can be multiplied. I think it's transformational. I think it's awesome. Now, clearly, it's also not a panacea because we still have, big money influences in our election, even on the county level. But I think it's been hugely successful. I think every county should do it, and I would love if we adopted it for state level offices.
Yeah, well,
Selfishly, I mean, morally and broad scale, I'd like it. I liked it before I got in, but selfishly too, it would make my job a lot easier. But I think it allows regular folks to get elected to office. People, I think people of color, I think women, non-traditional candidates who don't necessarily have a huge Rolodex of rich people. I could go on and on. I think it's a great idea, and I think that every office in the state of Maryland should be publicly funded.
well, thank you for that. We'd like to see that sort of a continuation of our transparency and sort of accountability focus that we have at the Civic Federation. Thank you so much for joining us this evening to kick off our new year at the Civic Fed. We've been off for the summer, and we're jumping back into it. Our next meeting, and I want guests and delegates to stay on the call. Our next meeting, just for you, Delegate Stewart, to know, it'll be in October, and we're going to have the new planning chair. Artie Harris is one of our speakers, as well as the acting planning director, Tanya Stern, talking about their work program for the next year and how they deal with some of these housing, zoning, environmental sustainability issues. So I think we're going to start inviting all of the delegation to participate. It's on, according to Jackie, on Monday, 9th of October. We'll invite everybody if they want to participate, because we think the more people that we have at our virtual table, the better conversation that we have. Please keep us posted on the things that you're going to be introducing in the next session so we could support. We pay a lot of attention to your work and your other colleagues. We're paying a lot of attention to Delegate Lopez's development review task force. Some of us have testified on that, making recommendations about how to speed up that progress and have more community participation. So we're interested in what the state delegates are doing for those issues. It did sort of dodge the bullet on MNC PPC issues. A lot of controversy around Senator Kramer's proposals. And we have this, but we're trying to participate in that process. So thank you so much, and look forward to seeing around District 19 and the rest of the county.
Yeah, thanks for having me again. This was a lot of fun. It was great to see everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Have
Thanks.
a good one.
Well, that was fun. He's a great guy, and he really is one of the big thinkers in the delegation and in the General Assembly. I'm glad he was able to talk to us about some of the things that we care about. I wanted to just take some time. I don't know if I'll be able to pull this off. I was going to show you our new membership system, because we're all about membership. We need to we'd like to increase the number of civic associations that we have, number of homeowners associations that we have, other groups, affiliate groups around the county, ones like the Women's Democratic Club, ones like the Montgomery Countryside Alliance, Conservation Montgomery, things like that. We'd like everybody to join so we can speak with a larger voice. But I'm not wedded to the idea of showing you guys this system. But if you'd like to see it, anybody like to see it? So that's Peggy Dennis. Well, she's one of us. That's like preaching to the choir. So I can do that anytime. I don't see.
Could you explain the due structure a little bit, like how much membership is and
Yeah, all right. Well, let me share my screen. I was sort of ready for this, but I just don't want to share my screen. Okay, let's see what happens here. Click. Okay, what's going on here? This is my screen. There you guys are. And I wanted to show Simply Dues. And here it is. Can you guys see that? Is that a yes?
Yeah.
Oh, good. Yeah, we can see it. I want you to see this thing. It says Simply Dues in the left-hand corner. And then it's got some text and things here. You can see this?
Yeah.
Okay, good. So you go to, there's a link on our webpage. There's a link in the newsletter to this new app that we have called Simply Dues, which, as I said at the outset, is has been developed by a Montgomery County resident who had some experience in merchant banking and telecoms, and he came up with this this simple system. And what you would do is you would go to the link and see some information introducing the Civic Fed, and then you get down to the, let's see if I can do this.
I think we're seeing your private page, Alan, and not
The private page of what?
it says, welcome Alan Bowser up there before logout, and it has information on there that other people would not be seeing when they go online.
All right, so let me see.
I'd be glad to share my own screen and walk you through how it looks from the website.
Okay.
Okay.
Let's
Got
try.
to stop sharing.
Let's try that. Screen sharing.
While you're doing that, I just want to mention that the Chris who developed this is a North Woodside community member who we had all these skills, runs our listserv, and we kept complaining that we didn't have a good way to keep track of payroll of our membership. And I recommend anybody can join this. We were using PayPal, and he just decided, since we kept complaining, we kept talking, what are we going to do? Should we hire Apricot? Should we do this? Should we do that? He actually developed this and made it into a company based on our conversations with the North Woodside Civic Board. And now any civic federation can sign up for it, and it's tailor-made really for civic associations like this and like ours to help. It doesn't have a lot of extra stuff that you have to pay a ton for. It just allows you to keep track of your folks, of your dues paying folks, and reminds them to pay their dues. That's basically what it does, and it does some other slightly more complicated text things, but not much. It doesn't act like a big giant, a program that has a lot of stuff like a business would need, but a small civic federation or a civic association wouldn't. So anyway, that's my spiel. Chris was amazing for developing this.
If you go to the main Montgomery County Civic Federation website, and it's Learn More, Join, and they have Apply Online, and you get to the page, the membership application, and right on the top is Pay Online. You can also then get a form if you want to fill it out by hand, or fill a form on the website and then print it out and mail it in with the check. But if you want to do the system, it's the first one at the top, Pay Now, and it takes you to the Simply Dues page for the Civic Federation. Okay, so then it's showing you this, and there it's first make a payment. I would like to pay dues, and so you select your organization. And so,
well, Jackie, go to the first one where it says Pay Now, because I read the question about how much it costs. So scroll down a little bit and
okay, wait a minute. Join online.
Pay Now. No, Pay Now. Go back up to Pay Now.
Well,
and then where it says Pay, when you click on it, it shows the tiers right there.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Okay.
And right there, Pay Dues. Yeah.
Okay, so there it shows you on let me see if I can make this a little smaller so you can, if you can't, so you can see it on your screens. So, whatever your size association is, or whether you're an individual, whatever, it shows if you click on something else, that amount will come up into the total. And you can choose your organization. If it's already been a member, it's going to be in there. And if you don't see your organization, you would click on there, I don't see my organization, and you would put in your own information. And then you can check out. So hopefully that's pretty easy.
So Chris has been very thoughtful and helpful, and that's coming up with a vehicle which is easy, and we will answer any questions. It's not very expensive to join the Civic Fed. I can see there the D with 601 households. You get 4 delegates. It's only $65. We encourage individuals to join for $15, and once you put the information in and you pay on the next page, Jackie, go to the next page and see if we can see anything.
Like choose my organization? Or-
Yeah, you
No.
can choose.
Well, no, I better not. I'll just do individual because it will say you're already a member.
Okay,
Uh,
then you go down to the bottom here. Okay,
I'm doing individual, check out. Oops.
and so you have to.
Oh,
So we'll go up to let's put in, just click on organization and just pick
pick my own.
well, yeah, just pick Glen Echo or Oakview. They haven't you've already paid yet, so Northwood,
It came up, highlighted here. Our membership is current.
yeah, put in another one that I can tell you that hasn't paid
Okay.
yet. Like
Okay.
North Bethesda Neighbors. How about that one right there?
Okay. It says they're
Well, that's good.
Hit clear, probably.
there. Okay, try it again. North Bethesda Neighbors. So still came up. They're current.
Try
Somebody else?
Camp Mill. Try Camp Mill.
Camp Mill?
Yeah.
Okay. Camp Mill. Ah,
There you go.
expired. So
I
it's paying
figured,
dues today.
All right, then click on checkout and see what happens.
There you go.
Okay. So on the second
So they came
page,
up. Yeah.
we get the membership level, which is good. We asked Chris to do that. The name of the association. So when you get a receipt, it's for the Kent Mill Civic Association. It shows the amount.
Now, is this the number, is the association the number of paid members or the number of households in the neighborhood?
Households in the neighborhood.
Yeah.
And then here's where you get to put in the delegate information. So when it's all said and done, we have this information on a spreadsheet. And when we send out newsletters, if we ever send out action alerts, we would be able to send it to these people. And as Jackie said, at the end of the renewal period or at the beginning of the renewal period, you would get a notice saying it's time to renew. And according to our treasurer, Jerry Garson, we've actually done pretty good this year. And there's been an uptick in new membership for the Civic Fed. We've struggled with the membership system for the last half dozen years. And we've always complained about it. We did, as Genevieve, I think, said, we looked at Wild Apricot and Join It and some other groups, and they offered a lot more than we need. When you sign up for this, it gets processed by a company called Stripe. So they take their little pound of flesh for processing it. But of course, they're a nationally known company. Chris gets his little piece too. So we don't get the full $65 in this case. We might get $60. We might get $59 or something like that. But we thought it was well worth the effort because we're able to stay in contact and develop a good email list that we could use for a bunch of different purposes. Go ahead.
So if the group finds this too much, there was an associate membership that was less money. Was that right?
Yeah, that would be for groups like the Montgomery Countryside Alliance. Click on pay dues. Yeah.
Associate group. So
all right, so like I'm the president of Safe Silver Spring, and if I wanted Safe Silver Spring to be a member of the Civic Fed, I'd click on associate group. We'd have 2 delegates. Montgomery Countryside Alliance.
So a civic association could not be an associate group, or could be?
Could not be.
Okay.
I mean, it looks like A, B, C, and D are the ones that we set aside for the civic associations and homeowners associations. And then we also, down below, if somebody wants to make a general contribution to the Civic Fed of whatever amount, they could do they could do that there. That would help our budget, would it, Jerry? Luella, do you have a comment, question? You're muted.
I'm pretty sure that when I tried to do that, it wouldn't let pay my dues as an individual and make a general contribution. At the time I tried to do this, I couldn't do it, and I ended up having to send it a check because there was no way I could do both of them. Now, maybe something's changed since then, or maybe I didn't understand the system, but it didn't, as I remember, I couldn't do both.
Maybe you
so-
can't do them at the same time. Maybe you need to do them, like do one and then check out or something, then come back in.
Yeah, I'm thinking
Well,
that,
no, it looks like on here like he's doing it. It looks like it's, I
Yes.
don't know why it was
Gave the
working.
whole total here,
Yeah.
but it's,
The
it
com-
also came up with this, whole dollar amounts only, please, which it is. So I don't know.
Probably
Uh,
when you
so-
put the
so
zero.
we-
in
Because
there,
I put
Yeah.
a decimal point in.
so we're working,
well,
so
yeah. So that's all. It looks like it's working now, so it's okay. But that was my problem. So I ended up mailing stuff in because who in their right mind is going to write a check or even charge for $15? That's insane.
well, we hope thousands of people will send in checks for $15, but hope springs eternal. So that's what I just wanted to share with you. We're pretty proud. We worked on it most of the summer. We leaned on Chris to come up with something at the beginning of our renewal year, and this is where we're at. And hopefully it's going to serve us well, and it's going to be good for him. He's an innovator who's trying to develop this for civic associations, small groups around, dues paying groups around the country. So good.
Alan,
Yeah.
as you're going through that, let's go ahead. You've got an individual now, like your
Okay.
organization. What will happen if I'm an individual and I can't select? How does that work? What clear is that? What did I do in there? Because there was some reason that I had trouble with this thing.
Well, you put your name down there under organization, your own name,
Oh, in
Okay.
your,
like Janie Smith or something like that as the
Yeah,
organization.
select your organization. They'll accept that.
All right,
Yeah.
I don't see my organization in the list, right? Is that what it
Okay.
is?
Well,
Yeah,
so
right
you-
there. And then you would put your name in there.
Yeah.
And
Okay.
and then you would
Yeah, that's okay. That's what and maybe that's how I handled it. I just, for some reason, it didn't work for me and I can't tell you more than that. So I ended up sending a check, but
And
that's
just
okay. It looks
below
like it's
that-
working.
just below that, where you put in your name, it says, I'd like to contribute as a non-member instead. Or, I mean, well, that's saying instead, but maybe you could. No, it looks like you can only do one or the other if you're making a contribution there.
Yeah, it's kind of yeah, anyway, for whatever it's worth, that was my confusion. Just,
well, that's why we wanted to share and try to work out these bugs. But
Now, let me make sure I've got Chris's last name right. Give it to me again.
Chris Betty, was it BETTI, Liz?
That's the one who did this program, right? Chris
Oh.
Betty.
Yes, he did. And I'm sure he'll do it for any you could use this program for your civic
Yes.
associations.
Right, well.
He was actually thinking about those groups, homeowners associations, civic associations that collect dues, and for us to do a delegate organization required a lot of extra elbow grease, and so we think we've got a pretty good situation. So there he is, Chris Betty from
It was just gonna be my question. cbetty@gmail.com. Perfect.
Well, you can also just, if you want to sign up, you can just go to the Simply Dues website. They have a website
Okay.
under Simply Dues, spelled simplydues.com. And that's probably the easiest way if you want to use it for your organization. And it was originally designed for civic or associations, so it's already tailor-made for civics.
Yeah, so thank you, Northwood Side, for giving us Chris and this product, and we hope he's enormously successful for it. Well, I see our numbers are dwindling, but I think we accomplished a lot this evening. It's 9:22. We usually at this point have committee reports. We've got a bunch of committees. I would add right now that we're looking for people to chair these committees to make our work more efficient. We're glad that we have 5 new members of our executive committee, and congratulations to Jay, Brenda, Cheryl, Dan, and Kim. We do have committees that need to be staffed to do the work of this organization, so it's just not on the officers and executive committee members. Does anybody want to say anything about, before we sign off, does anybody want to say something briefly about education? I'm learning everything I know about MCPS from Montgomery perspective and MoCo through 60. I don't know if that's a great thing. About the environment, I think we had a pretty robust conversation about heat islands and artificial turfs and PFAS and things like that. Something that is of interest to this group. Legislation. Peggy?
Yes, I would love help with somebody who is interested in county legislation in particular. If anybody is interested in keeping an eye on county legislation, please let me know and work with me.
The other part of this is Committee for Montgomery. So the Civic Fed was one of the founders of Committee for Montgomery. I've been the delegate to that for the last 4 or 5 years. And this past year, they elected me secretary of Committee for Montgomery, which advocates on behalf of the county to the state government. Its big deal is the annual legislative breakfast, which is in December at the Marriott in Rockville. And you can find them at committeeformontgomery.org if you're interested in that and want to be a member and participate. Planning and land use. I'll just reiterate that for our October meeting, we've got the acting planning director, Tanya Stern, and the new planning chair. And so we're very excited about Artie Harris, who many of us supported for planning chair, to talk about his vision for the planning board and the commission going forward. And Tanya Stern, of course, she knows all about the nuts and bolts of the work program. So we'll be able to ask questions about the environment and housing and transportation. I believe she was the former planning director of DC, I think, before she came to Montgomery County. Public finance, public safety, transportation. Jerry, a short statement about transportation.
Our county executive, Mark Eldridge, is working on improving the American Legion Bridge and a small portion of the Beltway from the Western Spur to the American Legion Bridge. And WMATA has just announced increased red line service on the red line in Montgomery County and through the district.
Thank you very much. As the delegate stated, not a big fan of the P3s, and doesn't look like the governor is going in a P3 direction for the American Legion Bridge toll lanes, basically from American Legion Bridge up to Gaithersburg. So that'll be an interesting conversation. Seems to be pushing ahead with that. Some people are strongly in favor and some people are not. Last one, utilities, and we usually don't have very much to say about utilities, except all of the rates are going up, and we can weigh in at appropriate time. Before we sign off, anybody else have any questions or any things they'd like to say for the good of the order? I don't see anything. I want to thank you all for joining us this evening, and hope to see you in October. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Alan.